6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard, and gather in their yield. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your unpruned vine. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. As we shared this story, there's this sense about every 7th year the land receives rest, a total rest for the land, woven into these sort of ancient codes. Leviticus is the people collecting the ways that they are going to live in community. It's like, I don't know, their policy work, and maybe there's some spots that they could have worked on, but there's probably some spots that we could work on too in our own policy work around town and maybe in Nebraska, I don't know. And so Leviticus is filled with these codes, these efforts for how we're going to live with each other. And one of them is this sense that even the fields and the vineyards and the land itself needs, deserves, and is worthy of rest. When you read Braiding Sweetgrass, and if you were here last week, you heard Melanie share a very different creation story than the one we inherited in our tradition. A story among the world's stories that doesn't end with the land being cursed, but the sky woman falling and mud being placed on the back of the turtle and all of the plants coming to be medicine for the people. We, of course, inherit two different stories that also couldn't be more different from that kind of creation story. The first one, God creates like a spoken word poet, like just with voice, everything happens. That first creation story, that very first part in the book of Genesis, it is, I know this is surprising, by the priestly class. The Hebrew Bible was compiled later. And so you have these different stories that they found valuable and kept both. And so the first story has this pattern of 7 days and rest, right? This cycle of creation and rest where God rests after creating, and creation happens with this creative voice. The second creation story that happens just a wee bit later, like the next chapter, is from the more northern kingdom later, and it is more earthy, and God gets their fingers dirty. They get in the garden. They are making stuff with Adam, this first creature that is spirit-filled dirt. And there's these two different stories that both speak of partnership and relationship and relationality, but there is also this deep brokenness in the story that we inherit, and a cursing of the people and of the land. And even still, with that propensity to think about the land as property, with that propensity to think about it as something that must be made into something else, as something to dominate, to have dominion over, which doesn't have to be understood as dominate, but is often understood as dominate. There is still this invitation that we all need rest. Humans need rest. People need rest. The animals need rest. And even the earth needs rest. It is this gift of Sabbath. And so I invite us to take in this work of Leviticus and then to be mindful of the world around us. And I want to invite you into this Irish author. It's okay. Mary Reynolds, she writes about this work that's called We Are the Ark. And maybe you're like, Ark, ooh, I have been to that museum in the South, and I do not want to go to this book. But don't worry, I don't think this Irish woman has any context for like what's happening in Kentucky or Tennessee, wherever it is. It is her saying that this landscape that she inherited has experienced colonization from the rest of Europe, that the resources were pulled out of it, that they were pulled in a way that didn't give life back into the community, and that we have this system of property ownership. And so what is something that we can do? Like the ark isn't coming, I think might be the argument that, not that she's making, but I would make about the ark. And so we have to be our own ark. And so she names that this hope. She began organizing her community and communities in Ireland to make this commitment that you take half of the space that you are responsible for, which might be a porch or a patio. It might be a deck and some pots with soil. It might be an entire backyard. It might be an acreage or a farm. And the commitment that she asks is that you take half of the land and work to re-wild it. And the other half, you work to grow your own food. And so I invite you to hear from her. A few years ago, my increasing awareness of the collapse of biodiversity and the lack of safe space for wildlife led me to start a movement called We Are the Ark. I asked people to give at least half of the land under their care back to nature and to grow their own food, and in the other half, if possible, We need to start considering that our gardens are part of an old world and to adopt a new vision for our future. Our relationship with nature must change. Looking at gardens as artistic endeavors or feasts for our senses alone is outmoded. An ark is a restorative, native ecosystem, a local, small, medium, or large rewilding project. It is an act of restorative kindness to the earth, a thriving patch of native plants and creatures that have been supported to be reestablished in the earth's intelligent successional process of natural restoration. She and others talk about this work of recreating prairie, of recreating meadow, of recreating spaces, the work of tending the soil, of healing the soil, the work of finding the plants that were here or there in the first place. And she talks about how long and how tender and how slow this kind of work can be. That it's not an immediate turnaround, but that it might be a surprise over and over and over as new creatures or returning creatures find a place that they had lost. As pollinators come back, as birds and small creatures and frogs and everything begins to flourish. This work of rewilding might invite us to think about the spaces we care for collectively. It might invite us to think about the spaces we care for individually. And what are the small, small steps that each of us can take? May we have the courage to dream them. May it be so. Amen.